On the morning of April 12, 1962, inside a North Carolina psychiatric hospital, nurses made a grim discovery. In two completely separate wings of the facility, 30-year-old identical twins Bobby and Betty Eller were found dead in their beds, exactly 5 minutes apart. Pathologists expected to find a shared congenital defect or evidence of foul play. Instead, the autopsies revealed perfectly intact internal organs. There was no poison, no trauma, and no disease. Left without a medical explanation, investigators listed the official cause of death as ill-defined and unknown. The hospital floor plan reveals a bizarre spatial anomaly. Both bodies were positioned at a highly unnatural diagonal angle. Removing the physical barriers to draw a straight line matching their angles reveals a chilling pattern. Their sight lines across the empty hospital perfectly intersect. Physical science and anatomy completely failed to explain how two healthy women died simultaneously in two separate rooms. To understand what actually killed Bobby and Betty, we have to look past the physical autopsies and examine the structure of their intense psychological bond, a connection so absolute that breaking it became a fatal event. Growing up in a quiet North Carolina town in the 1940s and 50s, Bobby and Betty exhibited an intense sibling relationship that appeared at first to be a typical bond. They were close, they spent all their time together, and they shared the exact same interests. Soon, that closeness developed into a strict, artificial physical mirroring. When Bobby's vision degraded and she was prescribed glasses, Betty, who had perfect eyesight, relentlessly begged her parents and doctors until she was given a matching pair. This mirroring eventually crossed over from behavioral choices into inexplicable physiological responses. When Bobby developed a severe, painful abscess on one of her teeth, Betty developed the exact same non-contagious infection at the exact same time. Any natural deviation between them was quickly suppressed. They styled their dark hair perfectly identical, forced a highly energetic extroversion, and joined the exact same school groups, specifically the Glee Club, to ensure they never had a solitary experience. This systematic dismantling of the boundaries between them represents the early stages of identity fusion. By mirroring every physical and physiological trait, they were effectively erasing the line where one sister ended and the other began. In 1951, the twins attempted to transition into independent adulthood. They moved out of their childhood home, rented a room in a Winston-Salem boarding house, and secured shared employment on the assembly line of a local cigarette factory. The pressure of this new environment fractured Bobby's psychological state. She abruptly quit her job and packed her bags, and retreated to their parents' home, where she locked herself in a bedroom and isolated herself from the outside world. Betty, who was thriving at the factory and enjoying her independence, watched her sister decline from afar. After 2 years of visiting on weekends, where Bobby would only return to her social self when Betty was in the room, Betty made a choice. She quit her job and moved back home, abandoning her own life purely to resync with her struggling sister. Once reunited, the women retreated entirely. They shut themselves in a single bedroom, spending their days and nights in total isolation. When they did emerge, they walked shoulder to shoulder, moving in robotic synchronization. If their parents asked them a question, they would answer in perfect unison, without glancing at each other. Betty's sacrifice was intended to save her sister. By abandoning her independence, she cemented a terminal codependency. Neither woman could now function or even exist in a vacuum. Desperate to save their daughters, who were now refusing to eat and dropping dangerous amounts of weight, the parents sought psychiatric intervention. Doctors observed the starvation and extreme withdrawal and diagnosed both women with schizophrenia. The psychiatrist prescribed a regimen of antipsychotic medications. Yet, despite strict adherence to the daily dosage, the twins' synchronized paranoid behavior only worsened. This sparked a grueling, multi-year cycle of involuntary institutionalizations. Inside the highly structured wards, kept in the same room and closely monitored, the sisters would regain their physical health. But the moment they were discharged and returned home, they instantly regressed into starvation and isolation. Frustrated by the lack of progress, the medical board proposed a drastic final hypothesis. They theorized that the only way to cure the psychological decline was to forcibly sever the codependent bond by committing them once again, but this time placing them in entirely different wards. The doctors treated the extreme enmeshment as a symptom to be cured. What they failed to realize was that this mirrored identity had become the only psychological structure keeping the twins' autonomic nervous systems running. When the hospital staff forcibly separated them on April 11th, the physical isolation immediately triggered raw, visceral panic. The sisters screamed, begged, and thrashed against the staff, terrified by the sudden absence. This diagram models the human nervous system to explain a rare medical phenomenon known as psychogenic death, sometimes called give-up-itis. In instances of absolute psychological shock, the brain's response to an inescapable trauma overloads the autonomic nervous system, literally sending a signal to the heart and lungs to systematically power down. The shock of having their shared identity torn away was so absolute, so entirely devastating to their reality, that both women simultaneously triggered this catastrophic shutdown cascade. They simply gave up the biological will to live, their bodies failing in parallel, despite being entirely healthy. Which brings us back to the chilling alignment of their bodies on that hospital floor plan. As their core functions failed, their final, dying act was to position themselves perfectly on their mattresses, facing the missing half of their consciousness. The tragedy of Bobby and Betty forces us to reevaluate human connection. When extreme enmeshment erases the boundary of the individual, the loss of the other becomes a literal, physical death of the self.